Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the ABA Center on Children in the Law and the National Alliance for Parent Representation. My name is Mimi Labor, and I'm the Director of Legal Representation at the Center on Children in the Law. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and we're all thinking about people, including our speakers, who are living through the threat of fires or in the eye of the hurricane, who have lost loved ones to the pandemic, and who are managing their own families while working to serve others. This is a trying time, and so we really do appreciate all of you joining us for this conversation. But right now, we're also living in a time of reckoning with inequality throughout the country based on racism, and today's conversation is designed to continue our critical examination of how racism and white supremacy impact child welfare and the families who are caught up in the system. As you know, this is level 2 of the conversation we started in July, and it's the third in our webinar series growing from the Interdisciplinary Legal Representation Conference we planned for last May. I've been lucky enough to be part of the discussions our team has been having to prepare for both levels 1 and level 2. I have learned a lot, and I know you will as well. But I've also been uncomfortable and challenged, and I am guessing that some of you may feel that way during today's conversation. That's okay. We need to feel discomfort as we figure out our part in making the system family and community centric for the sake of all children. During the webinar, I encourage you to connect with each other and with our speakers through the chat box. That said, please don't use the chat to appease your discomfort. We encourage people to sit with their discomfort and be mindful of the topics that make you feel this way. There were a number of people who are part of the planning for this conversation. All of us want to thank Corey Best. He spoke during level 1 and contributed a great deal to today's program. He couldn't join us today, but his ideas are part of us. Our committee co-chairs, Michael Hurd, Caitlin Becker, and Bree Colthurst helped to keep this group on track, and Bree will be joining the conversation today. And committee members Jill Cohen and Wanjira Gaithka lent the panel a great deal of support and encouragement, so thank you all. And finally, I'd like to thank the panelists for all their work and spiritual energy. They have put a lot of both into this program. They are each brilliant and inspire me so much. We have Milena Arnaud, who's a social worker at the Center for Family Representation in New York. We have Bree Colthurst, who I just introduced. She's a parent advocate at East Bay Family Defenders. MJ Jihad, who's a clinical consultant and the director of MJ Consulting Firm and the director of MX Cultural Consultants Collective, EC3. Renee Jones, a social worker at the Washington State Office of Public Defense, and Belu Osby from Washington State Office of Public Defense. And finally, Meredith Wallace, a lawyer at East Bay Family Defenders. I am just beside myself of excitement to hear this conversation, to take part, and I hope all of you enjoy it. And right now, I will turn it over to Belu. Thank you again.
Thanks, Mimi. I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Belu Oglowski. As Mimi mentioned, I'm from Washington State. I am a social service specialist serving families here through the Office of Public Defense. I want to start by doing a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional land of the First Peoples. For us here in Seattle, these are the Duwamish people of the past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I hope that you all, wherever you are holding space for the Indigenous communities and lands on which you work and live. In this acknowledgement, we resist the erasure of Indigenous histories while also working towards honoring and inviting truth. I also wanted to take another moment to thank the ABA Center for Children and Law for this platform. I want to shout out my wonderful panelists. You guys are amazing, and it has been such an inspiration to get to share space with you and to continue this work with you. As Mimi mentioned, Corey Best, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. I also want to shout out that much of his contribution, most of this presentation was his contribution. And so I want to make sure that we give him a thank you, and to all of you behind the scenes. Thank you so much for your patience, your tech savvy, and just being so supportive of us. And thank you, of course, to all of you who are joining us today from across the nation. So I think the first thing that we really need to do is to go over some community agreements. So community agreements help us identify ways to create intentional space for growing and learning together. In this space, we seek to understand, we assume good intent, while also acknowledging impact. In using these tools, we can challenge ourselves and challenge others to recognize that we are coming from different places, but also just being able to grow in this work. Community agreements are usually something that is cultivated together. Considering the format of today's presentation, we weren't able to do that. So we hope that you can observe these community agreements with us here today. So the first is choose authenticity over comfort, embrace messiness and kindness, just show up as your authentic self, be mindful, practice personal and group accountability, be aware of equity of voice. Sometimes we are challenging folks to think about how much space they're taking up in the chat, whether you're bringing sort of your own discomfort to the space as opposed to really setting aside space to intentionally listen. So really think about that equity and voice. Really listen to the same way that you would like to be heard, and honor subjectivity versus objectivity. So with that, we'll go into some terms and definitions. It's important that we have a shared language to engage and support anti-racist work and movement. We recognize that this can be confusing, but unfortunately, without an understanding, some of this language or interpretations of this language can unintentionally be inflammatory or divisive. So it's really important to hold space to learn and to really build a shared language together. So the first term that we want to review is race. We would like you all to understand that race is a social construct that's created to concentrate power and legitimize systems of dominance over communities of color. Race is in no way biological. There's no gene or cluster of genes that's common in all Black people or all white people, etc. In fact, variations in skin tones is a result of successive human migration from the continent. And by the continent, I mean Africa. Race designations historically aren't rigid, as we've come to believe. For example, Irish and Italian people in the past have been considered non-white. Also, white identity has been manipulated to include, for example, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders at points in our history with the aim to further oppress Black people. So we just want you to keep those things in mind when we talk about race. So racism is a little bit different. The definition of racism is race privilege plus social and institutional power. It's a system that advantages based on race and a system that oppresses based on race. We also want you to understand that a white supremacist system is supported and dependent upon our collaboration across class and across race. For example, a lot of these, an example of this is sort of our feelings of internalized superiority and inferiority. We sort of collaborate in building and upholding white supremacy because these things are instilled in us. The next term that we want to unpack is white supremacy. Corey did an amazing job highlighting for us what sort of the pillars of white supremacy are, and I want to make sure that we maintain that language. And so Corey had said that the first pillar is of white supremacy is slavability and anti-Black racism, which is based on the idea that Black people were meant for bondage and servitude. The second pillar is genocide and colonization. The idea that non-Indigenous people should eliminate Indigenous people in order to claim lands and resources. And the last is Orientalism, which establishes that certain groups of foreign people are menaces to society. These pillars don't only victimize POC communities, but incorporate them into the oppression of others by discouraging and punishing solidarity. One method by which this happens is sort of your proximity to whiteness, that there is a potential to avoid discrimination or experience discrimination to a lesser extent if you have a lighter complexion, for example, or are Indigenous as opposed to Black, or identify as someone from an Asian background as opposed to Black. It's also important to keep in mind that because race is a social construct, the idea of white supremacy can be deconstructed. So this white supremacy is so embedded in our culture and our collective identity that it no longer requires overt racist intent to reproduce itself. So continuous interactions between internal, so bias, privilege, internalized racism, and external, interpersonal, structural, and institutional, manifest bias and perpetuate racist impact. I know this is kind of a mouthful and can be a little bit confusing, so we can unpack further. Internal on the left here deals with our biases, privilege, and internalized racism. So again, that idea of ideas that we've internalized about our inferiority if you are a person of color, or superiority if you are white. On the external end, we have interpersonal, which deals with the way we interact with others. Institutional, so institutional policies and procedures that create different outcomes in different groups. And structural, the reinforcing effect of multiple institutions. So how all these institutions, how these systems work together to compound racist impact. This visual, this American Dream game visual does a really good job illustrating concepts from the previous slide. So the institutional here, for example, is racist legislation and policies such as redlining, which you can see there on the path, segregation, Jim Crow, structural, which again is the compounding interaction between systems. And an example of this might be poor schools and the compounding effect of the wealth gap and the compounding effect of bias courts and policing, and how these work together. I also wanted to be intentional about saving interpersonal for last here. I think I took for granted when I saw this visual the first couple of times, the white man in the corner there saying, "Are you just slow or what?" And I think we all do to some extent. I think that this kind of thinking is really pervasive, and it demonstrates how strongly people, even in our work, align with the narrative that position in this game is earned. There's clearly a lack of knowledge around these systems and how they work together to intentionally disadvantage and oppress communities of color. We often see disparities, but we really struggle to assign fault where it's actually due. So a lot of these things, this winding path here, is due to white supremacy and the systems that uphold it. So really this attitude of "are you just low or what?" really just demonstrates a lack of understanding for how these things function. And I recognize this in a lot of the way that we talk about our work. So really making sure that we understand how difficult navigating these systems can actually be for communities of color. So we also want to recap the fundamentals in level 1. So in level 1, we discussed the child welfare system and that it was founded in white supremacy. We discussed racial myths and how they continue to justify and justify disproportionate treatment of communities of color. In level 1, we also talked about child protection and how it's carceral and prioritizes retribution. And the child welfare system is an industrial complex that commodifies communities of color. We want you to keep in mind as we continue learning together, these concepts as we continue learning together. I suggest, if you haven't already, to go through and watch level 1. I think there are some really impactful ideas there that would help you better understand what's happening in the levels that follow. But unfortunately, we don't have time to really unpack these a whole lot more today. So today we'll be having conversations about calling out performative anti-racism in our workspaces, orgs, agencies, and our affiliations. So we're going to do this in a few ways. One is by interrogating white supremacy in traditional contracts. So by traditional contracts, we mean professionalism, hierarchy, civility. We want to consider our motivations and urgency in racial justice. So why now? Why are we just having this urgency around racial justice and racial justice organizing, and really the validation of Black lives? We want to unpack inclusive representation versus tokenism in our workspaces. We want to identify what gatekeeping and white supremacy in data collection looks like. And we want to discuss equity versus equality in representation for our clients. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to MJ, and she is going to be dialoguing with Bree here for a moment.
Hey, hi there. Welcome everyone. My name is MJ Malika Jahad. I am a clinical consultant, and I work with my agency, the MJ Consultant Firm, where I work with Garnett Lightham's office as a social worker as well as parents counsel. Also have another organization where I direct and come together with a collective of cultural consultants, and we work with agencies to move towards the direction of anti-racism and also learn what that is. So welcome everyone. We're really excited to continue this very important conversation about the manifestation of white supremacy in the child welfare system. To all my colleagues and to everyone in the background, you all inspire me to keep fighting alongside you. So I thank you for that. Now I want to talk about how this webinar may look a little different. Not only will it look a little different than others you participated in, but I want it to feel different. I want it to feel different as in the fact that I want this conversation to hit people so individually that it doesn't only start a conversation within yourself, but it helps transform us to make real, actual change. In all transparency, the way that this platform was put together was by my colleagues and I have had years, as well as bringing this together, multiple conversations about how to reach this audience, how to reach as many people as we can. So from level one, we focus more on the individual relationship that people have with white supremacy, and they're learning what their experience within that white supremacy relationship. This conversation, I wanted to focus more on the organizations and the agency changes. So that's what's going to be different. What I need you to hear and to understand today is when we speak of agencies and conversations, we're not necessarily talking about the agency that you may work under or affiliated with or employed by. When we're speaking of agencies, this can also mean independent contractors. I am an independent contractor, but I am a part of a larger agency within the child welfare system. So I want to be able to make sure that you guys can understand that this reaches CASAs, Garnett Lightham's, independent contractors, RPCs, parent advocates, social workers, and thus far, right? So to know that this conversation is for absolutely everyone, and we're talking about it as a whole. Another thing that I need you to understand, and this is going to be greatly important, is that you are the man. You are the system. I know that a lot of people, what they like to do, especially in white America, is separate themselves from white supremacy. And we say that, and I've been guilty of saying this as well, as yes, the system is so messed up or the system is broken. From level one, we've understood that the system is working exactly the way it's supposed to work. We're just the oil in the fuel that keeps it going and keeps it running the way it's supposed to, the way it was made. So I need you to hear that it is not a separation between you as a person, especially as a white professional in this field, and the man and the system. That is more of an invention to ease people's guilt. So that even though we can see the outwardly racism, we like to try to cover it up by saying that this is not what I'm affiliated with. The racism in the child welfare system is so prominent and it's so visible that I like to compare it to like a splash of red blood paint on a white canvas. You can't miss it. It's there. The reason why I have to make this point, especially again to white professionals, is in order to deconstruct the racism within our systems, we have to deconstruct it within ourselves. And that means having a good and a strong understanding of that. Another point that I want to make sure that I let the audience refer to or to understand is when creating this level 2, we wanted to make sure that everyone was able to, again, be a part of this conversation. So I use this analogies with my colleagues, and they know I'm going to take it there. But I want to make sure that I'm able to break it down to all of you so we can all be together in this and be present. But the way that I describe, and I laugh at this, so I'm going to try to not laugh when I say this, but the way that I describe the racism, white supremacy within organizations, especially in the child welfare system, is that you have this potato salad, and the white potato salad is potato salad with raisins, right? Okay, we don't do that. We, as in Black America, we don't do raisins in potato salad. So when you have someone that brings you this bowl of potato salad with raisins in it, and then they say, okay, let's make it taste better. So let's put some Lowry's, let's put some Tony's. Shout out to Louisiana, Slap Your Mama season, it's really good too. They bring this potato salad bowl to the picnic and say, okay, yes, this is not what it's really supposed to be. Yes, it doesn't belong here, but can you make it taste better? So the seasonings is the diversity. The seasonings is this surface level fixing that we try to do, but that's not how we're going to get to it. That's not how we're going to get to where we go. So again, not allowed. What this conversation is about is more about changing your organization within itself and looking at it and not adding Lowry's on there, not adding Tony's seasoning, not adding the seasonings of diversity to make it look and to make it appear that it's better, but actually changing the entire ingredients. Because anyone that makes good potato salad knows that you need to have like a good foundation of like mustard, but that's not the point. The point is that I want us to absolutely understand that we have to get to the foundation of an organization to be anti-racist within the system. So, in speaking of the foundation of white supremacy within organizations, we have to bring it back to the idea and the terms that we all know about being professional and what professionalism in an organization looks like. And again, the organization is not necessarily just who you are and who you work with. I am a part of an organization, though it is just myself as a private contractor and so forth. I want to challenge you as an organization, as an independent contractor, anyone connected within the child welfare system, to look within yourself to see, what do you define professionalism like? What does your organization look like? What is that foundation? An example of looking at how you can not only do different, but be different is look at your organization as a whole versus the population that you serve. So if you have an organization of 20, let's say about 40 people, and the population that you serve is, let's say 50% Latinx men, but you don't have one Latinx male in your organization, you are upholding white supremacy. You therefore are saying and continuing the narrative that only we can fix you. Only we can fix this population, this community, and so far. That continues the conversation, and that continues as an organization, the narrative that the white savior complex, and that you need whiteness in order to cleanse, to recreate, to make better communities of color. I want you to also look at what your colleagues within the organization, again, the colleagues that just do this work, and provide examples of what that may look like to yourself. So for example, you have colleagues that may not be, again, the people of color that they're serving, and yet they're coming up with what they believe is best practice. I'm not understanding how we can come up with what's best practice without actually looking and representing and respecting the community that you are there to serve. So that is the foundation of what this conversation is about. The conversation that we're having today is based in understanding what performative anti-racism is versus what actual anti-racism is. So the performative is adding the seasonings on things that should not have seasonings and so forth. I want to transition into a conversation with one of my colleagues. We became colleagues through this panel discussion. And I want her to give her experience and her understanding and her position of where she is currently, where we sit in America, in transitioning this conversation of racial equality. Ms. Bree Coulthers, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for bringing your expertise to us.
Of course.
I want to start by asking you, how did you get involved in this work?
Thank you. So powerful, ladies. I began, I got involved in 2008 when my youngest son, Love, was born positive tox and removed out of my care. Mind you, I also reunified with him a month later. So I was able to go into a program, have my son with me, and navigate successfully the system. But mind you, doing that transition was so, I wouldn't have that for a worse enemy, how I was treated. So while in program, I was able to go back to college, study sociology, studied race equity, studied social work before getting hired then at the Department of Social Services in Alameda County. And I stayed there for 11 years before coming here at East Bay Family Defenders.
And what do you currently do as your current position?
So I am the founding senior defense parent advocate. And what that looks like, I'm at court for detentions. I'm supporting parents who are dealing with probation, criminal justice, trying to re-enter back in society, amongst building a curriculum for parent advocates who are coming behind me for this organization.
Awesome, awesome. I know that they're very grateful to have you there. I want to transition into asking you, how does it feel to be one of the only Black women in your office?
The only Black woman.
Okay.
It gets so long.
Of course.
It gets lonely when you don't have that someone of your culture who can relate to you, who can see the same struggles. I don't have that person who understands me, what I've gone through. That culture piece is so important, it's so huge. You know, it gets so lonely.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. You bring such depth and such powerful perspective, being a parent involved within the system, then moving towards a professional in the system. With all your expertise and just your life, what do you think needs to happen for organizations to be successful in being anti-racist?
Honestly, it's having, if we're serving the Black and Brown community, it'll look awesome to hire the Black and Brown. You know, a lot of times, I know it's hard and to get applicants or people to come to our organization, come to the agencies, come to the different foundations to see whether or not, you know, they'll fit in or cannot trust. I know for me, trust is huge. Thinking I'm coming into an organization and you know what, we're on the same level, and then you turn around, you're not getting the equal. You're feeling totally different. But if we're out there serving the Black and Brown, we need to practice what we're preaching. We can walk it, we need to talk it. And that'll pay it. That'll make a difference. That'll show some effort. That'll show, okay, well, you know what? I'm doing my homework. I'm trying to see, you know what? Do more trainings. If you don't know, do your homework. You know, do your own research. Let me see how I can help change the system. Let me be a part of the solution instead of a problem. You have to. You have to make it.
Absolutely. It reminds me, Bree, of the conversation that you and I had when we spoke about how, you know, for so many years, people of color have had to learn white America. We've had to learn that culture out of survival, out of being able to eat and have a job and communicate with society outside of our culture, because it is dominated by white supremacy. So when I hear you say do your research, I hear you say learn the way that we had to learn to be anti-racist the way that we had to learn to internalize our anti-Blackness. That's what I hear. So
it is very important to do that, you know, put yourself in someone else's shoes, you know.
absolutely.
What I had to go through out in society, it was like, it's a survival mechanism. So now I come into here, I want to feel part of. I don't want to see that I have to compete to have my voice to the table. I want to say, hey, you've earned this. Come on in. Welcome. We welcome you. That's all. You know,
Thank you.
I love the work I do. I didn't have a parent advocate while navigating the system. So it's so crucial for me to pass that torch to help the ones who don't have a voice yet, who can be able to come to the table and sit down and say, you know what, I successfully navigated. I can do this as well. I can find my own voice at the table now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Bree.
Of course.
Melina, can you help us understand why now? Why are we just now validating outwardly within mainstream people of color experiences?
Sure. So, hello, my name is Malina Arnad. I'm a social worker at the Center for Family Representation in New York City. And I think that the first thing we need to acknowledge, and it plays a huge role in everything we've been experiencing, is the pandemic. So a lot of us, or most of us should have been, right, sheltering in place for 6 months. And it played a huge role, and we need to acknowledge that. And the way that it played a role is that people were, so in two different ways. So the first is that we spend a lot more time on social media, consuming news. Anyone who gets the screen reports from their iPhone, the weekly ones, you know, I think many of us are embarrassed about how much time we spend scrolling. But the second part has to do with how vulnerable we've been. So we're all experiencing trauma. So white America, for the first time in a very long time, or probably for most people ever, were restricted in what they could do. So for the first time, a lot of people were not allowed to come and go as they pleased. They were limited in who they could see and where they could go, if they could go to work. And that created the perfect moment for vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, we saw white America be able to see and experience traumas that they had never been able to see and experience before. And this is not to say that they could identify with them. It just means that there was a space to start to see, actually, I should clarify, to start to see what that looks like. And we, in the first part of this webinar, in part 1, we talked about George Floyd's murder as a pivot point. And I'll mention that again today because it's very important. The combination of the vulnerability, people being in their homes, and understanding trauma, experiencing their own traumas, allowing them to see the murder of George Floyd and connect to it in a way that we have not been able to see. You know, I think everyone's talked about, we had a lot of planning conversations building up to today. And I said in one of them, well, the videos are out there more. So that's part of it. People are seeing videos more. And Bailu challenged me and she said, no, the videos were out there. And when I really stopped to think, they've been out there. So what is it that's different now? And I think that I challenge you all to think about that too. Why now? Why George Floyd's murder, not excusable, but how many have we seen since then? And how many did we see before that? And what is it now that's different? And I think between the vulnerability and then also what we've seen is a different conversation. So we have mass media talking about these murders, talking about framing not as an issue of white supremacy, but an issue of police brutality. And I would challenge everyone to reframe that conversation as well. So we've seen, I think we've all experienced the conversation of police brutality. And in that also the conversation that has come up in this time around defunding the police. And I just want to take a second, because this is another conversation we talked about what it means. What does defund the police mean? And we have all seen, I think there are many articles that came out about the shift. We need to shift funding from the police to other social service agencies. We have all seen, or I shouldn't say we've all, some of us have seen in alternatives to calling the police, calling the child welfare agency. And I would challenge, we cannot shift funding from a police system to other policing systems in our communities. That is not the solution. So when we talk about defund the police, what we need is not community policing, not through social workers or mental health counselors that are coming from the outside. And as Malika said, putting the seasoning in. What we need is community, is making decisions for the communities about where that funding goes and how we allocate it, because it is for them, from them, right? I think that's always the part we need to keep in mind. And I would encourage, when we're having conversations about police brutality and defunding the police, that we shift it, that we shift to not community policing and not alternatives to community policing, but about community care and community restructuring from the community itself. I also think the combination, right? So we've talked about the pandemic, we're talking about the shift, the little bit of shift that we've seen in conversations about police brutality. And I think all of us have been inundated with emails from different organizations and different companies and celebrities about Black Lives Matter. And I want to take a second because this is a complicated issue. I think people stand on different sides of what that means. We've seen a lot of community community monitoring. Who said this and when did they come out? Celebrities being targeted. You didn't come out and support Black Lives Matter. Why now? Black lives have always mattered, right? It wasn't after why now? And I think that with the combination of, it was the perfect storm of things that came together. And I want to take a second to talk about the statements that came out in the child welfare world, specifically to our work. I think I saw agencies that I had never seen come out. We saw prosecutors' offices issuing statements, right? I think many of our own agencies issuing statements. The statement is the very beginning. I would urge that is actually, I was also trying to think of an analogy because I think people like those, that's like the warm up, and it's not even the full warm up. It's like the kind of part where you're like loosening up before you warm up for real to play. That's what the statement is, because what we haven't seen, the second part of that statement, which is what are we doing? What is the action coming from it? So the statement, that looks good on the other side to a lot of people. But on the inside, what does that mean? What is that doing for the staff in your offices? What changes are you making? What is that doing for, most importantly, the communities that you serve? So where is the second step? And that part, I haven't seen a lot of statements out there with what that second part is going to be. And so I challenge all of us to question, to respond. I don't know, respond to Uber when they sent you their Black Lives Matter statement. What is the next step? But more importantly, what are we doing as child welfare as the next step? How do we make the connection between police brutality, defunding the police, mass incarceration, topics that are being discussed now? How do we make those connections to the child welfare system? And how do we do that in an amplified way? Now is the time, right? But we have to do it genuinely. And we cannot do it by issuing statements only. It's what we back up with it, because those are the optics. So I feel very passionately about this. Go ahead, MJ.
Oh, okay. I saw Ms. Beilu. I know we're all very passionate about this. I want to talk more about, or have the conversation around the power piece, because what people don't necessarily understand is when people are saying defund or move money in a different direction, we're having another conversation at the same time about power. How are we transitioning? How are we navigating? How are we moving this power around? Because what white supremacy is power. It's power over others, right? It's power over others. So whenever we look back at our organizations, who holds the power in your organization? Because usually the way organizations are built is there's like a board of directors. Those are usually diverse, right? So there's a board of directors, then there's a director, chief director, attorneys, social workers, parent advocates, and so forth. So we work within a structure that oppresses people of color, right? We work within the structure because usually at the head of these power structures, the organization, especially within the child welfare system, are a lot of whiteness and a lot of white people, right? So the whiteness hold the power. So I, again, challenge organizations, individuals to leverage that power and to move that power around as well, the way that we do funding. So I wanted to add that in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I actually saw in the chat, I'm sorry, I missed the name of who posted it, that their agency didn't issue a statement. What they did is they issued a picture. And in that picture, they have their staff that's Black and brown. And I would guess that is not the leadership. And I think that also speaks to it. It's about the power dynamic shift, not what the optics are. So thank you for sharing that.
I would also say, Melina, I think that you brought up a really good point about defunding the police and how we've had lots of conversations in child welfare about reallocating that money to child welfare. And I really, I think it's important that we think about child welfare as a continuation of the carceral injustice system, right? It's meant to surveil and police Black and brown families, Indigenous families. And so I thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's such an important point.
Yeah. I mean, I want to hand it over to you, Beilu. And I mean, I think it's important to talk about what representation can mean and what it looks like. And do you think we have inclusive representation in child welfare?
So truly inclusive, I'd say no. And I think I want to start by unpacking what it actually means to have our teams, agencies, orgs be representative of the communities that we serve. I think lots of people conflate this with diversity, but inclusive representation is far more complicated. Diversity is sort of variations in personal, physical, and social characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, age, education. But inclusive representation really requires diversity. But we do a grave injustice when we come to diversity without inclusive efforts and equity in mind. So I want to go back to what inclusive representation might look like, but I think it's really important to really go through and very carefully define some of the terms that I just used. So we'll start with inclusion. Inclusion refers to the procedures that integrate and implement everyone. So inclusion is about people with different identities being valued and welcomed within the team, agency, or organization, and feeling that their expertise and their knowledge is leveraged. Equity is the process that acknowledges unequal starting places, and makes a commitment to correct and address imbalance. So sometimes the idea of barriers and advantages can be a little intangible for folks. And so I want to give a few examples. So I think we've all heard that candidates with white sounding names, for example, are more likely to be called back for interviews. We also, I think it's fairly common knowledge among us, especially that female candidates with similar credentials or the same credentials are considered less qualified just because of gender. And so these are examples of how we are inequitable in our status quo every single day. When we can't hold diversity and inclusion and equity as separate concepts and really understand how they interact, we can't really set clear goals around strategies to undo the impact that these have had. So being able to pull apart these definitions is really vital. So I want to clarify a little further. If your organization or agency is asking questions like how are we more diverse, how can we get more diverse people into our organization, or how can we incentivize recruiting diverse candidates, then the focus is really diversity. Inclusivity, you are really asking questions, using inclusivity, you're really asking questions like, what are the experiences of the individuals within marginalized identities within our organization? What barriers stand in the way of people with marginalized identities feeling a sense of welcome and belonging in our organization? What can we do differently to support our team members in more equitable ways? So you see the tone of those two sets of questions are very different. One is centering diversity and tokenizing people, and the other is really working to build space for people with different backgrounds to feel comfortable, safe, and welcome in that space. So getting back to the original question, I'll reiterate, no, our spaces are not representative. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that they are inherently racist and perpetuate white supremacy. I want to sort of acknowledge I want to unpack this a bit further. So firstly, I think this because in developing an inclusive practice, we are working to dismantle historical and systemic systems of oppression. So this really calls for consensus and understanding and what that means. So we really need to understand the impact the white supremacist and carceral institutions have on communities of color, like Milena was saying. We all should know that affirmatively that BIPOC folks are disproportionately representative in our injustice system and the child welfare system because they're disproportionately surveilled and policed. We should also know that BIPOC communities are not predisposed to abuse or neglect, that this comes from racial myths and it's not based in any level of reality. We should also know that poverty is often wrongly equated with neglect, and that BIPOC communities suffer from this. Their children are by and large taken into care more frequently because of this fallacy. Poverty is not neglect. People aren't poor because they're lazy or immoral or irresponsible. Poverty is a capitalist structure that intentionally deprives people of meaningful opportunities, for example, employment, education, and housing. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard the euphemism white is right. We perceive BIPOC families through a lens of white supremacy, and we make decisions that have racist impacts because of it. We all do. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that in order to really be inclusive in practice, you really have to consider if your staff or if your team looks like the community that you serve. So although we're not monoliths and our perspectives, we're not monoliths and we don't have this, one Black universal experience or one universal experience for the identities that we belong to, our perspectives are valuable in sharing systems that work for us. So practitioners don't need to share the identity of people that to really be supportive, but really understanding identities and connections to power, privilege, and oppression is important. And BIPOC people live this experience every single day. And so it's something that connects a little bit more for us. So it's important that your teams are representative for that reason as well. Also, I want to be challenging folks to think about whether your leadership is representative. I think sometimes we'll see teams that look representative, but the leadership all the way up is white and mostly male, right? So really be thinking about even if your team looks like it's diverse, your organization is not representative if all of the leadership is white. The next thing I want to talk about, sort of my last reason, so my last critical sort of analysis of this is that you really need to be invested in the community that you serve to be representative. And I think what that means is, are you showing solidarity to your communities, to the communities that you serve? Are you actively engaged in the community you serve? Do you understand the barriers that your clients are having to navigate? Do you understand the resources that are available in those communities? Are you making choices with their interests in mind, right? So really, all those things are so important. Another sort of aspect of this is, do you live in the community that you serve? And I think this is especially important because money is really important. So if you think about the tax money that is being taken out of communities to pay our salaries, And we're taking that money and putting it and investing it elsewhere. And those communities might not actually need our additional money, right? And so you're really just sucking the life out of this community and continuing to oppress it, essentially, when you don't live in the community that you serve. So we really need to be, in being representative, we really need to think about how we're being intentional about who we hire, where they are, and the fact that these resources are actually going back, excuse me, to serve the people that we're actually meant to serve. I'll take a sip here really quick. So really anything short of these things that we discussed is not inclusive representation. And it's essentially just diversity, which is a symbolic effort that lacks in its equity commitment, which in effect is tokenizing the people of color that are in your workspaces and in your communities. Diversity is allowed, but we shouldn't be seeking permission to exist. And I think that's a really, really important point. Solidarity that uses minority voices to increase visibility, so increase your platform around how you're doing anti-racist work, is performative. If it fails to amplify the voices of the people of color, of the marginalized identities in your workspaces, in your communities, then it's performative. And really it perpetuates the racist white supremacist system that we exist in and that we work in. I want to transition this to Renee. I think that even if we were able to navigate all of these things, and even if our practice was truly representative, I think we really need to consider our affiliation and our proximity to institutional power. And I want to really think about how gatekeeping upholds white supremacy.
Before we get there, actually, if we can just kind of, I want to make a couple of points, Belu, of what you said. First, I want to shout out to Kate Casper. She's the one that said that, you know, the picture that was presented is our picture of leadership, and we do have people of color, like we're all people of color. But then also what another attendee said was, and Miss Umi Hawkins, my apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, was that we as color are put in these positions to continue to police our people. We do the things that we have to do out of survival, because again, though we don't want to do what we do, we don't believe in it, we still have to do it out of survival. So it is not necessarily the best thing to have an all people of color policing all communities of color, because essentially what another attendee said is that we are just policing in the child welfare system, us within this agency that we do. So even as an advocate, as a parent, there's, I'm especially excited to hear about Ms. Meredith and Bree whenever they get to that portion about what it looks like in the court. But essentially, as a person of color that does this work, that has been in the system myself, in the child welfare system, we end up telling our clients and perpetuating the anti-Blackness, that we cannot be who we are in order to be successful in our cases. And in doing so, we uphold white supremacy, not by choice, but more by force. So I just want to make sure that I put that I can have an all Black agency, but if I'm not doing what I believe is truly best for that community, which is probably not to even have a case open in the first point, in the first, time, then I'm adding to the problem. I am, again, the oil. I said this in level 1, but one of my colleagues had said this, and I was greatly offended. And he said, you uphold white supremacy. And I'm thinking, I can't. I am a woman of color. I'm Native American. I am like every other minority that can be out there. And he said, but you are the oil that keeps this machine going. It does not run without us. We are the man, we are the machine, we are the system. We are a part of it, no matter what color that we are. in order to do some true change, we have to dismantle it. That is bulldozing everything. That is not adding a Band-Aid to a gunshot wound. That is not saying that let's add this seasoning to this potato salad so it can just be digestible, because as you guys have agreed with me, potato salad and raisins just don't go. So I say that to say that, yes, we can have diversity. Yes, we can have diversity is completely different from inclusion. But when we're thinking about inclusion, what Belu said, when you're including people, those people that are included are dismantling. Diversity don't have the power, they just have the looks. The inclusion have the power to start making these real changes in the system. So before we move on to Renee, I know that a couple of my other colleagues wanted to jump in on that as well.
I just wanted to add that I think that also speaks to this, like, what the perfect storm that came together and why we can't stop, because diversity is a solution. It's easier or fundamental change. And I want us to really challenge and push back on, we only have a little bit left of this trend, of these moments, right? We're starting to see there's less interest all of a sudden, right? Things are going back to normal, places are opening. That trauma that people experience that they could connect with and identify with, it's waning. And so I think it's really important that we continue and realize, back to, you know, if we're still in the warm-up, this is a marathon. And we haven't started running yet. And so I think it's really, I just want us also to hold on to this moment and do everything that we can within our agencies, within ourselves, to keep it going. Because as things pass and as we continue on with new challenges, I don't want us to forget these moments. And I think, you know, I fear that, and I think a lot of us do, we have 500 people here today. And I hope that in a year we can get 500 still, when we're not in a pandemic and when people hadn't just seen videos.
Absolutely. I think that it's also, I think what the point you brought up was really important. I think we need to be leveraging this space that we have, right? This platform that we have and the attention that we have. We know that it's, like you were saying earlier, that it's not founded in any real push to progress racial equity, but we have it. So we have an opportunity to educate people and to challenge them to grow in that space. And I agree. I think that we should absolutely take advantage of it. MJ, I also really appreciate what you added. I think that in our conversations in setting up for this, I think we initially wanted to talk about sort of performative anti-racism in practice and how it relates to, like, actually how we do our work and how we can create more space for our clients. But I think what we ended up deciding was that we don't have the capacity to be anti-racist in our workspaces. How are we can't extend that any further, really, right? Because we are so limited. And so I think that that's where a lot of this conversation progressed out of. And so I think that, MJ, again, to your point, we really need to be thinking about dismantling this system entirely. These are solutions, these are things that we should be thinking about, but we really need your collaboration in challenging your organizations, your agencies, institutions with power that you have affiliation with, to really just dismantle, right? Dismantle the system and do something better that's actually equitable, that actually would create some real and lasting change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I completely agree. I know that I said this as a community, and Bree and I had talked about this a little bit more, and I know that I've shared it with you guys, but when people individualize this work, and mind you, individualization is a westernized idea. It is a westernized theory, right? This is how white people operate, is very individual. But you are working with communities of color and people of color, and we come from a collective organization. We come from a collective people, which means we work together. So the way that you help dismantle organizations and white supremacy is based off of this hierarchy in power. The way that you dismantle is that you have to dismantle within your organization. And that means that you are bulldozing what your organization looks like. And that means everyone comes together as a community, because we all know that there is hierarchy within the office, that so-and-so has this power, so-and-so can do this. Well, I can't really get with this. I had to meet with my so-and-so for so-and-so in order for these policies to change. For you to be in an organization like that, but then work within a community that you say that you appreciate, that you say that you want to protect, that you say that you want to be there for, you are not modeling that community. So if you truly want to start being more anti and not performative, but anti-racism in your organization, you would have to start by bulldozing that. Because it seems like for there to be legit change, and as you can tell on the news, unless consumerism is burning down in white America, no one cares, no one listens. There's people that never had conversations about race until a Target was burned down, until a Chili's or a Wendy's got in the crossfire, right? Our white America is consumerism, individualistic consumerism country. I mean, of course, we're much more than that, but what makes us beautiful is that we have this collective culture within ourselves, but it is not being respected at all. So I challenge the individuals that do this work, guardian ad litems, RPCs, CASAs, especially people that specifically work with children. You cannot love the Black and brown children without loving their families. You cannot love the Black and brown parents without loving their communities. We are all together. That is what we are. We're all together in this. And that is the way that our communities work. So by you tearing down white supremacy, you have to start within yourself, because those Black and brown children become those Black and brown parents, become that Black and brown community that are not being respected within the child welfare agency, including by individuals that continue to dismantle families of color.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure I was able to make that point as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, MJ. I want to reframe this transition and this question to Renee. So if our practice is representative, or even if our practice is representative, how do we need to consider our affiliation and our proximity to institutions with power in our gatekeeping? Renee?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Belu. And like MJ, excellent points. Like all of the gatekeeping pieces, like fits all right into this next part too. So first of all, I want to talk about what gatekeeping, because it's kind of been thrown around as a just kind of a word. So gatekeeping is a role of power. It's determining who does and does not have access to resources, which policies or office rules to enact or to enforce, who does and doesn't have access to information, where we spend our limited time, who we stay late for, who we believe in and fight for, who we exclude. Every person in the child welfare system and on multidisciplinary teams are gatekeepers at some level, all of us. Social workers, social service workers, contractors, attorneys, program managers, judges, child advocates, CASAs, everybody. Whether we intend to or not, we determine worthiness based on our actions or our inactions. And whether we like it or not, we make all of these decisions on a daily basis through the lens of our biases. Structural racism is endemic. We've talked about this in level 1 and throughout this webinar as well. It's part of the fabric of our history and our society. Without the explicit intent to see, to understand, and to address subtle and overt manifestations of racism, organizations naturally conform to the culture in which they exist. This means that we have a major responsibility as gatekeepers to be actively and consistently doing the work to challenge the status quo and to push back on our systems that are steeped in white supremacy, and to ask those difficult questions with every decision that we make in an open and non-defensive way. So we should be asking ourselves, how have I or my organization prioritized time? Where are we spending our money? Where are we demonstrating commitment? Who was hired and why? Does our team reflect the community we serve? How am I deciding who gets extra help? if we're not asking these critical questions in every capacity and challenging our responses to those questions, then biases and white supremacy remain in place and play out in our practice. And I know for me, like as a white person, it's critical for me to challenge my own power and privilege and see that my whiteness is another level of power within gatekeeping. If I'm not actively aware of my privileges and my savior complex, then I'm not doing justice to this work. White supremacy also determines who we listen to and who we classify as experts. For instance, we often bypass the voice of parents as experts in their families' lives. As soon as the label of child welfare befalls a family, the stigma takes hold, and parents frequently are overlooked to make decisions regarding their children. Attorneys are also seen as experts in understanding and applying the law, but in dependency law, because of the nature of dependency, there's another layer of needing to intersect with social work. Attorneys as gatekeepers have a responsibility to make decisions about which parent to serve, which parent gets extra support, which parent they're spending extra time with, who they're filing motions for. Here in Washington, attorneys are determiners of who gets a defense social worker assigned to their cases. And we can only work with about 7% of the cases that are filed in King County, which makes attorneys' role critical as gatekeepers. Attorneys make decisions regarding which parents are seen as capable or needing support, no matter what parents will be excluded as attorneys make gatekeeping decisions. And as defense social workers too, we have a responsibility to make decisions on which parents to prioritize, from case assignment to where we spend our time to who gets resources. Similarly, so I also want to just brief on this about, so for instance, CASAs is a good example of another gatekeeping role. So court-appointed special advocates, sometimes they're called guardian ad litems. I think that they are pretty consistent in every state. And they are assigned as a gatekeeper on case, or as a stakeholder on cases with an incredible amount of power to express the best interest of children in dependency cases. CASAs, they make recommendations based on what they believe is best suited for children, and child advocates must complete training on how to volunteer, but they don't necessarily have to come from a background of expertise in child welfare or medical or child development, child safety, or social justice. In fact, most CASAs come from a middle-class background, are white, and are over the age of 30. And now I'm coming from a position of, that, so as a white woman, having to check that privilege and recognize that role in cases when CASAs who mostly fit within those criteria are coming onto cases and not having that privilege checked and not having that gatekeeping checked, it's a problem. Simply being able to take the time to volunteer in this role establishes that CASA is financially able to manage donating their time. And frankly, CASAs come from a very powerful role making determinations and recommending that determination to the court. And so I know, again, this comes from a well-meaning place, but again, we can come from a place of saviorism, especially like what we discussed in the first round of this webinar, a place of white saviorism. It definitely fits within where white women fall. And I encourage anybody to go back and check out that webinar too. And so really what I'm saying is that we need to define who are our experts, and they must be critically examined. This is also really true for data. Okay, so I know some people are mentioning in the comments about data. Data is gathered and used really heavily in child welfare. It's often seen as kind of impartial. It's as a comparison for what's normal or typical, as separate of biases. Data is used in motions to the court, in services that parents do. It's used in evaluations to determine the program's effectiveness. Data is what drives evidence-based services in which families are in the child welfare system participate. And data is used to develop timelines for when kids should reach permanency. Data is also used to develop tools like risk assessments, psychological testing, and diagnoses. It's used to guide legislation and determine funding. So you can't actually ask to fund a program without having the data showing that it works. It's critical and it's vital to social work world. But just like every single one of our systems that we've been discussing, data is not immune from white supremacy. Data is constructed by people. It's subject and even prone to biases because usually someone is trying to answer a specific question by gathering the data. Someone has to choose to collect the data. Which data do you collect? When do you collect it? Where do you look for it? Who do you ask? Who's willing to respond? Who is in power that is motivated to collect this data? Every one of these questions changes the data that you end up coming with. What we know is that hundreds of years of oppression and systemic racism, Black and brown people have largely gone underrepresented in data collection. The census is currently underway right now for the year 2020 and is supposed to give an overall count of every person in this country. And yet Black and brown people living here will be twice as likely to be undercounted, and white wealthy people will be twice as likely to be overcounted, which means less funding being diverted to communities of color, which has an ongoing impact to families we serve. On the most basic level, most tools that we rely on in the child welfare system are not based on the communities that we serve. How can we ethically move forward representing parents without questioning those tools? And to take a step further, how does discretion within the existing tools further marginalize Black and brown communities? This doesn't mean that we shouldn't collect data or use it. It means that we have to be really critical about our existing structures and think critically about the measurements that are upholding as standard. We know that our systems are built on the basis of white supremacy, so we cannot untangle data, our tools, or our measurements from structural biases. So if somebody's saying this is an evidence-based service, well, what was the makeup of the pool of participants in that study to make that determination? And does that fit with what's relevant for Black and brown parents we were working with? What information and data was considered in making federal timelines for permanency? Prior to ASFA being implemented in 1997 nationwide, parent-child reunification was occurring at a 5-to-1 ratio with adoption. So for every 5 children returning to their parents, only 1 child was being adopted. 23 years later, that ratio has been reduced 2-to-1, which has reduced the chances of children going home from 80% to 50% just by this policy alone, in favor of quicker permanency. Is it best or even ethical to permanently sever the ties of a Black parent to their child when data that outlines federal timelines is embedded in white supremacy? Considering all the structural disparities that exist, should there be a different way in which we are approaching our work to promote equity? Should we be evaluating the way in which we refer families to account for structural racism? Here in Washington State, I am pretty sure it's common in most states, we have a safety assessment that determines risk to a child. The risk score is calculated for a family through a list of questions, and questions are asked about the number of children in the home, for instance. And if there are more children or younger children, the risk score goes up. The number of caregivers, if the home has a single parent, it increases the risk score. How many times there's been child welfare call to the home, the more calls, the higher the risk. If the referent was a medical professional, then the risk score increases. All of the answers to these questions and more determine an overall risk and recommendation for the family's next step in child welfare. This is where the intersection of systemic racism plays out. For instance, Black and brown families across the nation are reported to child welfare agencies at a much higher rate by medical professionals. Black mothers are 9 times more likely to be referred to child welfare at the time of birth and 8 times more likely to be suspected and tested for drug or alcohol abuse than white mothers. This means that Black families are getting higher risk assessment scores and more likely to have their children removed because of the way in which risk is determined. Also, one in 10 Black children has a parent behind bars compared to about 1 in 60 white kids. That means that families are getting dinged for single parenthood due to the systemic racism and targeting in the criminal justice system. How are these disparities not brought up as a valid ethical violation in every court hearing in the child welfare system? When you mix how systemic racism shows up in all of these other systems and how it increases the likelihood for child welfare involvement and account for likelihood of getting your child back if they were removed, it's criminal to continue to perpetuate these systems. It's without a doubt that the methods and tools that we use are inherently racist. And we need to be consistently examining how our tools are used in representation. So with that being said, I know we have Meredith on. She is an attorney and she does this work. Meredith, my question for you is, do you represent clients differently based on race?
And my answer would be yes, which is what I'm going to explain, but also going to have a conversation with Bree. I'm a parents attorney in Oakland. The way that I would explain the difference in representation is in law school, we have this hypothetical where it's meant to teach you the difference between morality and law. And it says that there's somebody drowning in a pool and there's all these people standing around the people drowning, and who has an affirmative duty to help them. And when you're telling law students this, the lead up, the part that's supposed to make them really surprised is to hear that almost no one has to rescue someone drowning legally. And the reason I'm starting with that, and I'm going to use that metaphor, is to think about the ways in which lawyers, who many of you are working with, I know there's a lot of people in interdisciplinary teams on this call, people who work in GAL, maybe some CASAs are still on the line after these CASA comments. If you held on, thank you. And in law school, there's so much work that goes into teaching attorneys something that they call professional responsibility, and then in court being officers of the court. And those aren't in a vacuum, right? Those are also based on white supremacy. So when we look at it in child welfare, if you think of the clients are in the pool and the attorneys, and also if you have an interdisciplinary team, the social workers, the parent advocates, we're all outside the team, like outside the pool watching our clients. Professional responsibility would say you have to give the exact same representation to everybody in the pool. And that's how you're a good lawyer. And that's how you're a zealous advocate. But if inside the pool, you have to ask yourself, is everybody drowning the same way? And I think everybody's comments leading up to this, I hope that everybody understands that they wouldn't be. And that I think it's now becoming more accepted to understand that Black communities are policed differently. I think that there's an extra step that everyone needs to take to understand that child welfare is policing, and it is no different. And what Renee was talking about with the risk assessments, every single one of these police interactions at hospitals, interactions at school, all of the increased reports that Black families get, that's a weight that the family has in the pool. Like that's a weight that's on that parent. So they're not just drowning, but they're covered in weights that they had coming into the system that have no bearing on why their child was removed. They're just something that you add to whether or not to remove a child. So for an attorney, the question is, if you apply the same rescue efforts to all of the people, despite the fact that you know that historically enormous effort has gone into dismantling Black families for hundreds of years, you should know, you reasonably should know, or you do know that the same effort is going to result in a disproportionate amount of your Black families drowning, right? And the separation of them and the adoption of their children. And I think the same weights apply in different ways for non-English speakers. I think it's more an evidence gathering, but and Native American clients. Now, federal legislation was meant to address the differences for Native American clients, but for some reason, even though there's active efforts for them, there isn't any for Black families. So we have to use a lowered standard for Black families, despite an equally problematic lead up to dismantling their families. And just that there, I think, is a really, I know there's a lot of people asking about practical things that can be done or legislation. I want it dismantled, so I don't know about all of the practical steps leading up, but active efforts for Black families would be something that I would be advocating for strongly. And I think what you have to understand as an attorney, for those of you who are on here, is the equality and representation will uphold white supremacy, because it's acting like all of this historic and systemic weight on your clients doesn't exist, and they're just coming in as individuals. And I think what I wanted to say is that once you know about those weights, attorneys then have to calibrate their representation based on addressing that. And I think how that looks practically, I do a lot of direct questioning of social workers about risk assessments, because I don't think judges really understand the risk assessments. So I will ask them to go through all of the risk steps that they have and then say to them, well, can that one change? Because that's a really important thing. I would say half the risks are from, and the judges are I can see them writing it down. So you're like, okay, will that one change? Will this one change? So in 10 months, if my client does parenting class and therapy and family therapy and supervised visitation, will they still be at a 6? And the answer is yes, they're still gonna be at a 6. And I think, and then when if they come back in the system, they're still there as well. What I wanted to differentiate this kind of calibrating from is something that I think attorneys do when we realize the weights. We often calibrate the wrong way, which is that, I'm gonna say that I'm completely guilty of this. I start worrying about how my clients will be perceived based on racism. And I sometimes interact with them or try to get them to behave in certain ways in order to make, what I think I'm doing is protecting. I think a lot of attorneys would say oh, I'm protecting them. I don't want them to be seen this way. But I think what I'm actually doing is participating in the same thing that I'm trying to fight. So I guess this is the part I would ask to Bree. Bree, do you see attorney, and I'll use the example of talking to the judge. Do you see attorneys shutting clients down from talking directly to judges?
Yes, I've seen them several times, dependency court and as in criminal court as well. For a parent who knows that their rights about to be terminated, and a parent who, a parent wants their child to know, hey, I didn't give up on you. Mom fought to the very end. I want my voice to be heard. Although my child's not there in that courtroom, but trust and believe there's a connection, and they'll know mom didn't go out without a fight. So many times we've been shut down in different systems where we were not able to speak. And finally, when we get that courage, because it's one thing I do for my parents, I assist them to find their voice. And so when they're finally able to voice their opinion in court, and then you have an attorney say, or a child welfare worker say, no, you can't talk. No, this is gonna hurt your case in the long run. I don't wanna hear that. This is not the time. I need to finally be able to, I want you to know the truth. This is what happened. This is what really happened, So it's very important. It's very important, especially for that person who's supposed to be on my team, who I opened up and started trusting. And then the trust is out the window, because after court, you're like, what happened? You didn't say anything that I needed you to say. I thought you represented me. I thought you were on my side. That hurts.
I think that what everybody should know about what Bree is saying is that is such a common thing for parents to say to their attorneys. And I think attorneys, as a protective mechanism, are often not hearing that as a complaint about racism from their attorney. They're hearing it well, you don't understand the system. I'm protecting you. And I think as attorneys, we need to challenge ourselves to hear those as actual complaints. And I think to understand that when we prevent our clients from speaking, and when we think we're doing something that is protecting them, if we're honest with ourselves, I think most people would say we're really, like, the primary feeling is trying to prevent embarrassment. And I think you're trying to prevent embarrassment for your client. But I think this is about, like, officer of the court versus zealous advocacy. Those are two things that you're supposed to be doing at the same time. And I think attorneys need to understand that those are in tension when we're talking about white supremacy. They're in tension because an officer of the court, that's designed to put some ropes on you and keep you down from making sure that you're doing what your client wants, right? So that's, like, the same reason that they're so reluctant to let parents represent themselves, because it slows it down, right? Like, and to question if slowing down the system is always about permanency. Like, obviously Renee has quoted some things that suggest that permanency hasn't actually, these timelines have not gone well for any of these families. And I think what I also hear Bree saying is that, and I'll ask this as a question to you, but part of what you're saying is that parents are silenced at multiple points in the child welfare system, not just not being able to talk to the judge. And that when we don't really honor that and help give people a space, then we're sort of re-traumatizing. Is that a good summary, Bree?
That's excellent, Meredith. You know, that's always happening, especially for us parents. And that comes to play as for the child well-being system as well. When I'm here trying to build that trust with the child welfare worker, and I'm here telling her my version of the story for the report, and then I'm at court and I get a report that has nothing I talked about in it. This is entirely switched around, and it's not anything that I have said. For one, it's re-traumatizing for me. As a parent who worked so hard to find my voice, for a parent who's been shut down all her life. Let me give you an example. As a younger person, I was molested. So I carried that for years, not having any support. What happens in our household stays in our household. Not financially, we didn't have anything in the community to help us, no therapists. So I thought, you know what, I could go on to work, get married, continue to go to school, and I wouldn't have to feel that. And then the divorce comes, it explodes. I'm here rock bottom because I didn't work on that piece. Finally, 43, I'm able to work on that piece. I find my voice. I'm here stepping up to go to court, and somebody tells me, shh, as an adult, as someone who worked on that trauma, you shut me down again. Come on now. It's totally different, totally different.
That is, Bree, so powerful. And I just want to sit with this for a minute. Because that's a lot. That's a lot. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm like Meredith. I've been guilty as a social worker, guilty of wanting to control my clients, right? I see other people of color as an extension of my community. So in the way that I operate and work, I see them as my brothers and as my sisters and as my aunties and grandmas and uncles and so forth. And that is another thing that's very different within organizations. It's not just, and I believe it was either Belu or Renee that said, how are you extending yourself to the community that you're serving? How are you a part of the community that you're serving? Because to tell you the truth, the way this should look is everyone should be upset. Everyone should be hurt. Everyone should feel this. If you are truly a part of the community that you are serving, that you respect so much, that you want to save so much, then how are you not feeling this PTSD? One of our attendees, Cody Russell, was talking about how toxic and where that PTSD and how are you as an independent worker, as an agency, contributing to historical trauma, historical racial trauma. That is huge. That is something that we have to think of. I know that I've been reading from what the panelists in this discussion has been having about the CASAs and so forth. The way that I describe not just CASAs, but anyone that is a non-person of color working with families of color, it is like this: I am doing this for this community. And I like to use this example of if someone is on death row and you are working so hard and you like, this is their last meal. And I worked so hard, they wanted steak, potatoes, this kind of sour cream, got them an apple pie dessert, and I won that and I got them that. This person is on death row. They're losing their life unjustly. Unjustly. We all know, we've all agreed that they're actually innocent. So how are we not holding every person accountable for putting them in jail? But we want to pat ourselves on the back for getting them their wonderful last meal. That's where we need to change how we think, because to tell you the truth, only people that understand, appreciate, and respect the culture should be working with people of color, period. This is why you get from a lot of Black people and brown people that I'll do it. Let me do it. Would you have somebody that is not in your home, that don't know your recipes, come in your house on Thanksgiving and cook you a meal? I don't want no raisins in my stuffing either. So no, I don't want that. So when you are advocating for Black and brown families, you have to advocate for them to give each other the solutions, for them to support each other through this, because you are in the way. You are in the way of progress, of healing, and of support. Let's transition to our solutions. Let's transition to giving people actual things that they can do so we can move forward and stop, as we say, placating. Everyone's placating these days. But as my wonderful colleagues say, performative. How are you being performative? Because right now we are being performative. So Beilu, can you talk to us about what anti-racist work should start looking like?
Yes. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice over here. Yes, absolutely. But before we get into that, I wanted to touch base a little bit more, or really just add a comment. I think that one of the tenets of our practice in parent representation in King County is really elevating and making space for the communities that we serve, for the parents that we serve. So really creating space for them to engage meaningfully in their cases, which I think which is how that's worded, I think. And I think that Meredith and Bree brought up a really good dynamic that I think that we don't talk very much about. Sort of this, when you're talking about social contracts, like you were saying earlier, MJ, and thinking about civility in our courtrooms, and how that really silences the people who are showing up to try and be protective and to advocate and fight for themselves and their families. So again, I think that we really need to challenge ourselves to think about sort of the structures that make it really difficult for us to give them space to do that. I think that a lot of times we have this language and we feel like it's intentional in our manuals, in our team meetings, but how are we actually being accountable to those? I think that across the board, I think it's probably safe to say that most of us are not. I also want to briefly touch on, I think a couple years ago, I think we actually, at the ABA conference, I think it was in Chicago, there was a segment that focused on civility. And a couple of my colleagues in King County, I think were present, and we had this dialogue within the group about how this concept is just embedded in in racism and white supremacy, and what that actually means to communities of color. And like Bree was saying, I think that it compounds the trauma that they feel. It disallows them from being open and authentic about their struggles, and to receive the support that they need to get through. And I think that's the most dangerous piece, right? The silencing. We can actually support people in being there for their families and showing up for them, and being happy, healthy, whole, if we're silencing them. So thank you both for that. And I think if nobody has any more comments, I'll move on. Yeah.
Yeah. I know we wanted to talk about how important it is for us to have these conversations about race and have these trainings within our office. Something that Belu said that was greatly important. And she said, by willing to invest in the learning opportunities to be anti-racist, you have to teach your employees that it's something that you're willing to do, that you're willing to put your money behind. So though we are having these conversations, what are you going to do? Because that is the first question that everyone asks. I know everyone from level 1 said, well, what do we do? And you have to start within your organization. You have to start dismantling the white supremacy within your organization. And of course, we don't have all the time to do that, but there are agencies and there are people that help with how to be anti-racist. Because again, we are placating, right? So again, I do this work. I work with agencies. I want to also shout out to all of the people within these agencies that have been bringing up race, been bringing up equality, been bringing up injustices way before it was popular, right? Way before it was this boiling point, because there are so many people in the office that's been saying, yeah, duh, been saying this, no one's listening. So make sure that you adhere to those people that have been speaking to that. You also have to think about the people that are not speaking about that, because that means that you have a culture within your office that is not safe to talk about that is not welcome to talk about racism and systemic racism and so forth. So keeping that in mind, that again, if you want to change the system, you change your organization first. You change within who you are first. Because again, if you are especially white Americans doing this work in other people's counties and cultures and families and so forth, with your individualistic mentality, you are doing so much damage. You are doing so much damage. It is literally, to me, the equivalent of I need to go to a doctor, but instead of going to the doctor, I go to my mechanic who happens to have a doctor. What is that going to do for me? You knowing a doctor doesn't do anything for me. You sitting in a training with nurses, though you're not, it doesn't do anything for me. So a lot of people are in these roles without really being in this role. If you are truly here to do some positive work, I tell my students that you need to be a social justice advocate first, and then whatever your professional title is second. So I'm a social justice advocate, and then I'm a social worker. You're a social justice advocate, and then you're a guardian ad litem. That's what we have to change, that mentality. Renee, will you talk to us a little bit about the radical inclusion piece?
Absolutely. So I think really what we need to be always looking at is radical inclusion. We need to have representation at all levels. And I think where that comes in a little bit too is talking about compensating and centering and hiring people that have lived experience in every position, that it doesn't just mean a parent advocate position, but that people who have the experience, there is a huge, there is so much that can be provided from bringing people in and centering those voices. And so another big piece too that that can be very helpful is doing parent surveys. So we talk about, I know this sounds, we talk a lot about like a customer service model where you're looking at, we're looking at how you're interacting with the parents that you serve and the families that you serve, and gathering data around that, you know, being intentional about how you're gathering that data and thoughtful, asking the right questions, but those pieces are really important. Also, I mean, challenge, like I talked about before, challenging your role as a gatekeeper, be critical, constantly be critical. That's what it takes to try to move forward. You have to be asking yourself the questions, or you're just focused, you're in a system that works on the status quo. And then the other piece is using data to ensure that you're analyzing that who you're actually serving is representative of your community. So not only that your organization is representative of your community, but that when you're getting, when you're being mindful of gatekeeping, you're knowing who is coming into your program and that it actually represents the people that are out there. So you know that if you're getting 90% of white parents coming in, that might not be, there's something wrong in the gatekeeping, and continuously examining that. So yeah, I think that those are a couple pieces. And then, so we have
I think we're transitioning to Melina talking about
Melina. That's
power.
right. Melina, do you want to tell us more about
Yeah.
advocacy?
I mean, I think that the number one piece to me of all of this is letting go of your power. If we white people, we people in positions of power, we professionals, we on this webinar, if we don't acknowledge that this will transform the way we operate and the power that we have, then we can't do this. So unless people become comfortable or accept that they will lose power, and it's unfortunate, I think we have to frame it in this way, but that in order to redistribute, right, to reimagine, I think it's really about reimagining a power dynamic that isn't embedded in white supremacy, that allows for systems to just perpetuate the same things they've been perpetuating. We have to redistribute power, and that power has to come from somewhere, right? And so I challenge those on this call in positions, in leadership positions, to step back from that power. And that's very uncomfortable. We've had a lot of conversations in our office. We are confronting this now, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be working and reimagining a system when people have been working in this system and benefiting from it, right? Many of us we've been able to work up, we've been able to be compensated more, our titles have increased. So all of those things, and stepping back from that, I think is very important. And the second part of that has to do with inclusive decision making. So part of taking some power away means inclusive decision making. And for those who are not in leadership positions in their organizations, or don't, I saw a comment earlier about we have to protect our clients. And what I would say there is that you also need to let go of your power and question that power and redistribute it. And we have that ability. And part of that, as I was mentioning, is the inclusive decision making. And that, like I said earlier today, that doesn't mean you have a seat at the table. It's not just being there. It's not consulted and then, we go into a room and we make this decision later with your input. It's about a collective decision making that values voices, not just the token voices, and not when it is only convenient. And that also speaks to transparency. So it's really important to have a shared power dynamic, to have decentralized power, and shared decision making means also transparency in that process. And then I think Bree, if you want to take it away.
You could talk all day about this, but I think for me, making sure that parent voice is at that table, especially if it's a parent who's navigated, who's gone through everything, who many systems, right now we're not dealing just of the pandemic of COVID. We're dealing with the racism. We're dealing with homeless, addiction. So we've been dealing with all kinds of systems, pandemics. So we've gone through so many to come to where we are today. So make sure that our voices are being elevated. Make sure that you're asking the questions. Don't think you have all the answers, being because you're white, step down and say, you know what, this is a team. Let's do this together. Let's build this together. Let's make sure our organization, foundations, and agencies are serving our communities, for we're looking at each other. I want to walk into to an agency and say, hey sister, hey brother, we can relate, you know? We need that. We need that. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Bree. Meredith, will you give us a couple of examples of what the fierce advocacy looks like?
We're running short on time, so I'm going to talk really fast. I think we had originally talked about just challenging people to basically make race visible in the courtroom. I think I'm challenging people to think about how often they mention race, specific problems that their clients face because of racial bias, like in their briefing, in actual negotiations. I think it's this enormous amount of work goes into de-racializing the courtroom, despite the fact, and we contribute to it. So I think thinking about that, oh, Caitlin's giving us a message that I don't have to talk fast. Too bad, guys. I only have one speed. And I think that just making sure that you're not participating in the erasure of racial difference in the courtroom unless magically a federal tribe has intervened. Like that's, I'd say, the most we ever talk about it. And like you have to wait for the tribal rep to come on. And I think if for the lawyers, when you have an ICWA case or an Indian child welfare case, if you think about the difference that is, like the way, and think about that more as a standard, like think about what it would mean if there were a rep that came in and said, the way that you are placing this Black child is not appropriate for their cultural ties. It's not it's not going to work. And actually, I think one thing we haven't said is centering adoptees' voices too. I think there is just an enormous amount of adoptees who are having conversations about the kind of trauma that they've faced by having parental rights terminated, and really making sure that the child welfare system understands that that's not an end point for everybody. That's all. I don't know who I'm supposed to pivot to though, because I wasn't watching the chat.
Mary, I think I missed my window to talk about sort of developing a consensus. So I think before we do tools and equity, I think I'll add that piece. So really anti-racism in our workspaces and in our practice really requires us to develop sort of a shared consensus that the child welfare system is racist, that it victimizes communities of color, and that communities of color are overrepresented in this space. Because of the racial myths that we perpetuate in our culture around people of color. And so I want to make sure that we're holding space for developing sort of that consensus. I think it's really, really, really important to continue to remind yourself that the child welfare system is in fact racist. There's no space for us to continue to have a dialogue about this. Like it just should be a fact, and it should be a centered space in the way that you understand your work. So with that, I want to hand it off for folks to discuss tools for equity practice.
Renee, I'm going to actually let you start that off, but I wanted to add in that piece that Meredith and Belu talked about it, and I know this has been in the chat as well, but I want to give a shout out to Miss Angela Tucker. She is an expert in transracial adoption. She is the one that's actually been educating me about why there is no ICWA laws and policies for Black and brown children. I think that we have to start there. I think that we have to start holding people accountable, our judges accountable, the department accountable, to actually put out there that you need to work differently, because we've already moved past and graduated from, I don't see color, there is no such thing, we're all the same. We've moved way past that, right? So we need to work differently. And we do that by changing policies, by changing the way we operate, because when people have to work harder, they actually don't want to do the work. So then more cases get dismissed. So then families and children will be sent home a lot sooner. So again, shout out to Miss Angela Tucker. You can Google her. She mentors a lot of transracial adoptees as well. She's absolutely brilliant. And then I'll let Miss Renee talk.
That's great. So I think we were just going to brief on quickly some tools. And so we talked a little bit, we talked previously about gatekeeping and about biases and how that's kind of the status quo. That's where things stay unless it's interrupted. And so ways in which you can challenge biases is by developing tools. And you can use tools with, oftentimes it's helpful to have a third party to assist in supporting and building those tools, because there's something about somebody coming in and disrupting a political system that's already set up, to be able to navigate and really cut to the heart of things. Also though, so ways in which you can develop equity on an existing team, the way in which Meredith explained kind of weighting in this pool, and everybody has different weights on, and everybody has different, some people have more of a burden, they have more weights on their body, literally. And so using the same practice isn't going to help. So you need to adjust practice in order to allow for equity to happen. And so the ways in which you can do that is acknowledging and recognizing that some parents have additional barriers, or some parents that you're going to be working with are going to have additional barriers. And how do you make sure that you're equitably serving them as opposed to just equally serving them? How do you acknowledge those barriers and help support that? And MJ has an incredible idea and thoughts, and I can't wait to pass it off to her.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So in all of my anger and passion, right? I have said, what is it that I can do? Like most of you guys that are independent workers, independent contractors that may only have yourself or you work with one other person, we feel very isolated, right? We have these conversations independently with people, but not necessarily, we don't have it within an agency because we don't necessarily belong to one agency. So what I've came up with, and again, all this anger and passion to create change, is I said, okay, I want to come up with a community collective of social justice advocates within the child welfare system. So what that looks like, and I have a list, and I have this really long list of people that I've had these conversations with that all agree that this field is absolutely racist, and we, the people, get to decide what it looks like. So essentially, this is how simple it is. There's a group of people, we come together, and this is right now, we're going to be within the state of Colorado. I'm in the Denver metro area. But colleagues in other counties, we all come together and we have conversations, and then we force change. The way that we force that change is we will then start looking at individuals in this field and agencies within this field and hold them accountable for being racist. Now, it seems very direct, but when you're working with families of color, that's what this looks like. That's what progress looks like. It doesn't look like we go around the back and we're begging, please, for you to just give us a chance and listen to our voices. This is where, while we're in the culture and in the state of Black Lives Still Matter, because again, we have a few days until Halloween, right? So because we still have this time where Black Lives Still Matter, we have to leverage this. We have to have time to gather together and then just start going after it. So I welcome people to create your own collectives where you're at. And again, a collective is just a group of people. You guys are on email, do Zoom, get together and say, these are the problems that I'm having. And even though that person is not within, your jurisdiction, you help advocate for them. You use your power, you use your voice as a collective to create change. So I am ecstatic about this new collective that I'm putting together. I'll make sure that everyone has my email address if you are in the state of Colorado and you want to be a part of this collective. And mind you, this collective is not a conversation, this collective is action. So this is not a place where you come together, because there's other times where I literally get hired to talk to people about what racism is and what anti-racism is and to move forward. But a collective is a state of action. It's a state of progress. And that's where we're going towards, and that's where we're moving towards, because we can change laws. We will change laws. We will change policies, and we will in fact become more anti-racist as a system. Thank you, guys.
The only thing I would add to that, you both gave brilliant responses, is that we have the communities that we serve should be really engaged in this process, right? Like we we need to be accountable to them. I think that one of the main equity tools that I think we can instill in our practice is really just employing like community advisory boards, like giving space for our communities and giving power to our communities to really judge if we're making a difference and how we're making a difference, and interact to develop space to build consensus around what it looks like to contribute to what's needed in communities. And again, I think we want to be really careful about assigning what we think we need in communities, but really giving people the space to advocate for their own communities, to speak for their own communities, to speak for their own families, and following through in supporting that voice, supporting that taking up of space. Does anybody else have any more thoughts?
Meredith?
I was gonna wave at people, but then I realized it would look like I had a thought. Sorry. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, so again, on behalf of the National Alliance for Parent Representation, the ABA Center on Children and the Law, I thank all of you out in our participant land for coming and thinking and being uncomfortable and engaging with each other and with us. But really, 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 on behalf of all of you who are engaging, thank you to our team. You are all incredible people, incredible women who are inspiring, who have taken so much time and energy to just share your thoughts. And I know that people have, just by the comments and what's happening right now in our little chat land, they have gotten so much out of this conversation. But I urge all of you to do what my colleagues have said. It's not just about taking for today and thinking some thoughts and then going back and doing the same things that we've been doing for a year or 4 years or 10 years or 20 some years. It's about taking action and making sure that we are sharing the power with the people who should be in power, the people in the communities, the parents, and the children in our system. So thank you for joining our conversation. And we hope to hear from you and engage with you on an ongoing basis. Thanks to everyone.